And we are live. And welcome to Climate Chat. I'm your host, Dan Miller, and today we're going to be talking about Citizens Climate Lobby and where it goes from now. You're going to learn what it is and what it does and what it's planning to do in the future. And with us, we have Dana Nuccitelli. Did I do it right? Okay.
Pretty close.
Close enough. All right, close enough, Nuccitelli. And Dana's going to give us his background. He's a key member of the CCL National. By the way, you're going to learn that CCL is all over the place with organizations spread out across the country and across the world. But there's a central coordinating group in, I guess, Washington. Where are you based, Dana?
Our staff is all over the place. We do have our government affairs team is in DC. I'm actually in Sacramento,
Oh, okay.
California.
There we
Yeah.
go. Very good. So let's get started. Why don't you give us first of all your background and sort of what led you to CCL, and then we're going to get into a little bit what CCL is, and we're going to go from there. So first, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I'm an environmental scientist and climate journalist and research coordinator for Citizens Climate Lobby. So I got interested in climate change like a lot of people when I saw Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth. At the time, my degrees are in physics and astrophysics, but that got me interested in climate change and climate science. And so I started reading about it kind of on my own to learn about like, is the information in that film accurate? So then I just on my own started learning about it. And then once I had kind of read enough books and papers and articles about it, then I joined a website called Skeptical Science, which is a
Mm,
basically volunteer-run climate myth debunking database.
one of my
So
favorites.
yeah, it's a fun one. So we have a big database of like over 200 climate myths that we debunked there, and so I joined in there and debunked a few dozen popular climate myths just because it was kind of fun and important at the time because there was a lot of climate science denial back around 2010, which is when I started in skeptical science. And so I did that for a while, and then the Guardian newspaper in the UK started an environmental blogging network, and they hired me on there. So I wrote for the Guardian for a little over 5 years. And then that got shut down, and I started writing for Yale Climate Connections, which I still do now. Great
Okay.
group of writers at Yale. And pretty close. That was in 2018, and a few years after that, I joined Citizens Climate Lobby on the staff. I also joined Citizens Climate Lobby as a volunteer around 2013 for the
Mm,
Sacramento chapter, and then I joined the staff 3 years ago.
okay. And before we get into Citizens Climate Lobby, I have to put in a plug because I don't do this enough on this channel. If you want to do a little bit to help climate, the easiest thing you can do is like and subscribe to this channel because that will spread the word. There's not a lot of detailed climate information getting out to the public, and even less so now. So it is something easy to do. And you'll also then be informed of our upcoming episodes, including one I'm trying to schedule the details with right now with James Hansen on his recent paper about accelerated warming and other things. He's going to talk about the current political climate and things like that as well. David Fenton, a returning guest who knows so much about how to communicate about climate. Peter Glick, who's an expert on water and climate. And Bill McKibben, who actually got me going in climate in the early 90s by an article I read of his. Certainly one of the most foremost climate journalists and activists out there. And he has a new book coming out, I believe. And so that'll be a little bit later on when the book comes out. So with that plug out of the way, why don't Dan, why don't you tell us about what Citizens Climate Lobby is?
Sure, we're a grassroots nonprofit climate advocacy organization. So the main thing we do is train volunteers to how to lobby their members of Congress in an effective way in support of climate policy solutions. And then we and train them to how to do other things like tabling and writing letters to the editor and op-eds and various things that build the political will for climate solutions. And we've got chapters, as you said, all over the country, all over the world too, but in almost every congressional district around the country so that we can lobby almost every member of Congress and their office and staffs.
Wow,
Very close, very
400 or
close.
something. Like, I mean,
Yeah,
that's
in
still
that ballpark, yeah.
that's pretty. And so tell us a little bit of what does Citizen Climate Lobby is also known as CCL. What does CCL advocate for?
Yeah, so we started for since our inception around 2007 or so, advocating for a carbon fee and dividend policy, which is basically when you put a price on the carbon content of materials, particularly fossil fuels, and then that revenue goes to the government. The government can then do whatever it wants with it, and our preferred policy is to take that money and send it back equally to all individuals as dividend checks or carbon cash back. And then the third component is that we have a carbon border adjustment, where if we have a carbon price and another country that we're trading with doesn't, then if our companies are exporting to that country, we refund the carbon price at the border, or if we are importing from that country, then we apply the price at the border so that everybody's on an equal playing field, so that we're not disadvantaging American companies for having this domestic carbon price.
So we'll get into that in a little bit more detail. But for those who are interested in learning more, I actually gave a TEDx talk on carbon fee and dividend, and it's linked below. And I also wrote a white paper with Jim Hansen on why fee and dividend is the best way to price carbon, and that also is linked below, so you can learn about it. It is a great solution, not one that we're doing. We're going to talk about that,
Yeah.
but it is a great way to phase out fossil fuels if done right. Okay, so those are the things you're advocating for.
So
Uh,
that's kind of
the
been
main
that
ones.
for a long time. But then we recently in recent years expanded to a few different areas as well. We've got permitting reform. We feel is a really important one because kind of what's holding us back from building enough clean energy and transitioning to a green economy is our inability to build stuff fast enough. So we've been supporting permitting reform. There was almost a permitting reform bill passed at the end of last year, just didn't quite get over the finish line. But we were supporting that. And then healthy forest policies, policies to plant more trees, essentially in expand forests or in urban areas, is another one. And then building electrification and efficiency, which has kind of started to transition into defense of the Inflation Reduction Act, because the Inflation Reduction Act has had a lot of great incentives in the forms of tax credits and rebates, including for building electrification and efficiency, that we're trying to preserve in the current Congress, so that because they've kind of got a little bit of a target on the backs of those particular policies, so we want to advocate for their preservation as much as possible.
Well, before we get into the Trump administration and what it's trying to do to destroy climate action, what are your thoughts on President Biden's uh, overall climate policy plus fossil fuel policy, together in his administration? What's your view on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think on climate policy, they got pretty much as much done as they could given the Congress that they were working with. It's when you have a 50-50 Senate, you can only get as much done as the 50th senator will do, which was like Bryce Kristen Sinema and Joe Manchin. But they managed to get the Inflation Reduction Act passed, which had, as I mentioned, a lot of great incentives for clean energy and important climate solutions. So, like, given those constraints, I think on climate policy, they did a really good job and got a lot done. Fossil fuel policy, there's constraints on how much the executive branch can do. There's arguments to be made they could have done more to restrict fossil fuel expansion. There's arguments on the other direction that, there's only so much they could do. So, I don't have too many thoughts on that in particular. I think, there's, we still have demand for fossil fuels, and it'd be great if we could just wave a magic wand and say no more fossil fuels anymore. But we still have cars and natural gas furnaces and things like that. So we can't just eliminate fossil fuels immediately. And they did do some significant restrictions on federal land leasing and things like that. Not as much as people would have liked, but there were some restrictions and a lot of
Hmm.
setting land aside for just preservation and things like that. So it's kind of a
They
mixed
also,
bag.
what do you think about their expansion of LNG, the liquid nat, I should not use acronyms, liquid natural
Liquefied natural
gas, what
gas.
we've now begun shipping around the world, which is you take natural gas, which is really methane gas, you
Mhm.
compress it and chill it, put it on a ship, bring it to a port, and then you can uh, warm it up and send it down pipelines. Uh,
Yeah.
what do you think of their role in expanding LNG?
Yeah, again, that's a challenge because there's only so much that the president can do. I know this some certain presidents would like to pretend that they can do more than they can do. But there's certain limitations given the laws that we have. And they tried to do a pause on liquefied natural gas exports while they did a study on their climate effects and updated the research on that. And then that went to the courts and the courts threw that out. And so they had to kind of
Hmm.
proceed, and they still kind of slow walked it a little bit, I think. So they were kind of doing what they could to slow down liquefied natural gas exports, but I mean,
Oh, is
those
that
are
that?
approved
Okay.
by like the Department of Energy, and there's like they're just following the laws, and unless there's a law that says no more liquefied natural gas exports, and there's only so much a president can do.
Well, actually, we're about to find that out because there's a president who doesn't care what the laws are, and
That is, yeah.
and probably will get away with doing a lot of stuff that may not be technically legal. I don't, in an emergency, you can kind of do anything. If there's a war, for example, you can just do things. President Biden never declared a climate emergency. Was CCL trying to get him to do that? Was that one of your platforms or anything?
No, I mean, even declaring a national emergency, there's only so much more, abilities that gives a president, so much more authorities. And so I think it would have, for example, I can't remember all what the specific limitations were, but it wouldn't have done a whole lot in terms of reducing fossil fuel expansion and emissions. And so it's not something that we were particularly advocating for.
Well, how about maybe putting aside anything that it allows you to do as a president or government? How about just making the public aware that there is a
Yeah.
climate emergency? Obviously,
Yeah.
I mean, I have to say it kind of goes without saying that a very large part of the public is not too concerned with climate change. They might say they are, by the way, if you ask them in a poll, but when it comes to voting,
Hmm.
they actually voted for a guy who denies that climate change is a real thing. It's a Chinese hoax and whatever, and obviously is backed by fossil fuel interests that are willing to, to give me a mil how much do you say? Give me $1 billion and I'll do your bidding or something. And he said that like live
Yeah.
on camera. Um, so uh, so that's I think a key part of it. And I'm wondering what is CCL doing to make the public aware and concerned enough to act about climate change? Is that part of your agenda?
Yeah, and I mean that's definitely a challenge that my people, when you poll them, they do say climate change. They're concerned or alarmed about it for the majority of people, but it's not their top priority when they vote. That's basically their finances in the economy. And so, one thing we do is, try to educate people about the connection between the economy and climate change, because like everybody's right now seeing, climate change is, for example, worsening wildfires and other extreme weather events, which is then increasing insurance rates, which then gets spread out throughout the insurance pool, and everybody's insurance rates go up, and nobody likes that. That's pretty terrible. So there's all kinds of direct economic impacts from climate change. So we try to educate people about that in writing or in presentations. Like a lot of our volunteers will do presentations in their communities. So that's a good way, or tabling in their communities and just talking to people about our policies and sometimes about these kinds of connections as well, although they mostly focus on our policies. But also just educating people about the policy solutions and why they're good and why they help people, and why, the different benefits associated with climate solutions, because that's ultimately what we want people to do, is support climate solutions, and so that we can get these things, get support for them and build a political will and get them passed.
So, all right. But probably you and I and everyone at CCL by this time we thought that climate impacts would get the U.S. and the world to begin to act on climate, right? Because now, okay, before we were telling you it's going to happen, and there were a few things were happening that might have been random climate events, weather events, but now, without doubt, right? We have the data before us. Everyone can. Hey, it's not like it was when I was a kid. They know it's changing. We're seeing things we've never seen before. Okay, we thought that would bring climate action. But the opposite seems to be true. Like, as you were saying, the climate-driven impacts such as migration, higher food prices, economic pressures, not only not yeah from insurance because of weather disasters are driving insurance rates, but this is instead driven the march towards right-wing governments who then try to dismantle climate policies. So it seems to be that I don't know what I was hoping for, or maybe what you were hoping for is not true. How do we? First of all, do you agree with that assessment? And if so, what are the kinds of things we should do about it?
Well, I'd say in the United States, things have generally improved because when we lobby our members of Congress twice a year, and we take notes about what how those meetings went and what our members of Congress have said. And it used to be that in a big chunk of our meetings, our volunteers would write, "This member of Congress just denies that climate science is real or that it's a problem." And that number has decreased over time, and now there's hardly any members of Congress who will deny the problem outright. So they will at least accept that there is a problem, that we should do something about it. So now the debate is just like, what should we do about it and how much action should we take and how urgent of a problem it is, which, I wish we didn't still have to have that debate, but at least it's progress from where we were just a few years ago. So things are moving in the right direction, at least in the United States, in terms of acceptance of the problem. Now it's just a matter of finding solutions that everybody can agree on that will at least move us in the right direction, which at least we got with the Inflation Reduction Act, and we're hoping to get some new policies in the new Congress as well.
It seems like you're, I have to say, I feel like I'm in a different world right now. What I've been reading in the newspaper recently, including today, is how the Trump administration is trying to dismantle NOAA and not only climate stuff, but like just weather reports. And also, of course, how you're no longer allowed to use the word climate change in certainly government grants, but even on government websites, and they're scrubbing government websites of climate change. I mean, obviously, I could go on. But
Sure.
that's so whether an individual congressman would say, I deny climate change, which is obviously very difficult to do in the era of climate change, except Trump does it. Um, but it's not like we're making progress. We're making anti-progress.
Well,
We're
so
regressing from even, I mean, it's not just a little bit of a difference from Biden. It's like fossil fuel interests have taken over the government, and we're not. I don't know. I may be wrong. I hope I'm wrong, but it doesn't sound like there will be much climate progress in the next 4 years. Although there's a chance. I have an idea there maybe there's a weird way we might make climate progress. We'll get to, but
yeah, so
isn't isn't it? We're not making. I mean, it's not going in the right direction, is it?
well, I mean that depends on how you measure it. So CCL, we lobby Congress. So in Congress, things are going in the right direction. You're talking about the executive branch, which the executive branch has definitely gone in the wrong direction and has been the last, since the Trump administration took office, it's been very hostile to climate science, in some cases hostile to clean energy, especially wind. They are very hostile to wind, but certainly, going after NOAA, going after any mention of climate change and grants and things like that. Like they have been very hostile to climate change. But we focus on Congress because Congress is who passes laws. We do still need the president to sign those laws if Congress passes those laws, but I would hope that that would be the case. But yeah, we're trying to get Congress to pass some climate legislation, and I think given that we have Republicans in the majority, it's better to have, the conditions today are better than they would have been several years ago in terms of a Republican Congress passing legislation that will help us with climate change.
Although that same Congress just approved climate deniers to be, lead government agencies and things like that. That's the same Congress, right? But
Yes, yeah. I mean, again, those were nominated by the executive branch, but then Congress has not pushed back against them. That's correct.
so give me some hope. Well, what are some of the climate legislation? Let's put Trump, whether he signs it or not, aside.
Yeah.
But what are some climate legislation you hope to see pass in the next 2 years? Let's say the next 2 years.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing we're focusing on is again defending the Inflation Reduction Act and the incentives in there for clean energy and other clean technologies, which fortunately many Republican members of Congress have said that they support many of those provisions, especially the clean electricity provisions, because they provide a lot of jobs and facilities and manufacturing in Republican districts. And the Republican majority is so slim that just a few Republicans in support would be enough to preserve those provisions. So we're optimistic about that. We'll be advocating for that. Another one I mentioned was last year we nearly got permitting reform done, which especially for building transmission lines fast enough so that we can then connect more solar and wind to the grid. Super, super important because transmission lines right now take forever to build. It's like a decade plus to build a transmission line, which is way too slow. And we nearly got a permitting reform bill over the finish line at the end of the last Congress. So hopefully, once they finish with tax negotiations in the current Congress, maybe they'll go back to a permitting reform negotiation package. So we're hoping to see something along those lines so that we can get more clean energy built faster. And then forestry, healthy forest policies that we're advocating for, we hope to see something. For example, there's going to probably be a farm bill passed. There was supposed to be a farm bill passed in 2023, and it got kicked to 2024, and now it's been kicked to 2025. So at some point, there will be a farm bill passed, and maybe we can get some good tree-related legislation in there to plant some more trees, which are not a huge solution, but they're beneficial. Yeah, and so those are kind of the main ones that we're looking for. And then another big one potentially is since we're not going to get a domestic carbon price, but the president is very into tariffs. An interesting idea is to put a carbon tariff on certain materials and
Like a
goods.
border duty, basically. That's the part of fee and dividend. Yeah.
Right, exactly. Just that component of a carbon fee and dividend policy, just the border tariff on carbon is it's got some potential, I think, in the current political climate.
What's your thoughts on this is actually part of the Inflation Reduction Act, but people don't know it was originally signed under Trump, and that's the 45Q tax credits for carbon removal. Actually, originally signed by Trump, it wasn't big enough. Biden made it bigger. Um, what do you see? Think that's going to survive? Because basically, it's something that Trump supported in the first place.
Yeah, from what I've read, the Republicans in Congress are actually interested in expanding potentially the 45Q, which is a tax credit for carbon capture and storage from smokestacks, essentially. So it captures it before it goes into the atmosphere and then either uses it or stores it somewhere. And then also carbon removal from the atmosphere, which is even a more generous tax credit for carbon removal from the atmosphere. So it sounds like it's going to survive. Whether, how effective it is depends on how quickly the technology can actually advance, because so far there hasn't been a whole lot of success in demonstrating those technologies, but things could change. I think fossil fuel industry is very interested in making that happen to capture that carbon and get those tax credits. And so that's why it's got bipartisan support because it's a somewhat of a climate solution and also a solution that benefits the fossil fuel industry. And
Yeah, I
so
know that's what I was going to say.
they're very effective
It's
lobbyists.
bipartisan because some view it as a, hey, this is great for the fossil fuel industry. They can get some money, and then some climate people think of it as a, we're going to need this to survive, and others think, oh no,
Exactly.
don't do it because it helps the fossil fuel industry. So there's a little more of a controversial one, but at least
Exactly.
together there was enough bipartisan support to get it passed.
Yeah, that's exactly.
Um, Gee, I'm reminded, of the phrase, best is the enemy of better, so don't let, what you ultimately want to do get in the way of making progress. Sounds a little bit like what you're talking about.
Yeah.
But there's also the phrase, sometimes good isn't good enough. And we're certainly, in terms of climate action, we're blowing past 1.5 on the way to 2. That was what Jim Hansen's paper was about. Faster than everyone thought, by the way. We knew we were going there, but now we're going there faster than we thought. Um, your thoughts on that?
I think those are both true. So in terms of doing our best, not being good enough, so far that has been the case. We have passed some climate policies, but they have not been sufficient to slow down global warming sufficiently to avoid 1.5 degrees Celsius, and we're still on a too much warming path. So we haven't done enough. At the same time, like each tenth of a degree that we manage to avoid is still an important thing to do. Like we have to reduce future warming as much as possible. And so I think we also have to keep in mind not to make the perfect be the enemy of the good. In our perspective on permitting reform, for example, there was a lot of opposition to permitting reform because, it would have essentially it would have sort of let some bypassing of some environmental protections happen, basically to expedite environmental permitting. And some people don't want to see environmental permitting be expedited because that makes it hard to stop fossil fuel projects, for example. But at the same time, those same laws that are helping people to stop fossil fuel projects are also helping other people to slow down and stop clean energy projects. And that's what we really need is a lot more clean energy really fast. And so if you're again saying that's not perfect, and so I'm not going to support it, then we're not getting the good, which is letting clean energy be built out fast enough. And right now, the vast majority of what we're building is clean energy. And so the faster we can build things, what benefits the most is clean energy. And then you get a faster transition away from fossil fuels to clean energy to reducing emissions as fast as we can, which again is not fast enough. But I would still rather to get there as fast as we can rather than even slower because it's not as fast as we would like to. It's not perfect.
Yeah, although the amount of clean energy that we have is actually irrelevant to climate change, right? I mean, that's kind of why we like clean energy, is that it doesn't cause climate change, but it also doesn't stop climate change. What causes climate change is fossil fuel emissions. And so far, I think on net around the world, not true on an individual, local, regional, and national basis, but around the world, 100% of renewables so far have gone just to increase energy supply, and has
Yeah.
not obviously not yet decreased fossil fuel emissions are at a record high. There's a difference between subsidizing fossil fuels and subsidizing renewables and phasing out fossil fuels. Which, by the way,
Well,
which is what fee and dividends all about, right? Is to get the price of fossil fuels so high that you just can't afford it, and you use the much cheaper renewables. But
yes.
it's not really the same to promote renewables as it is to phase out fossil fuels.
Well, the challenge there is that power demand is increasing because we're electrifying things, because developing countries are using more energy, because of AI and power centers. There's a lot of reason why demand of electricity is increasing. And so we are building renewable energy really fast, but so far it is basically only meeting that increased demand. And so it's not able to phase out fossil fuels in most cases. In places like Europe, there's some exceptions. But for the most part, it's not doing a lot to phase out fossil fuels yet because it's just meeting that demand increase. But if we could build renewables faster, then it could both meet the demand and phase out fossil fuels. So that's why we would like to get permitting reform done to build clean energy even faster so that it can do both things, meet the demand increase and phase out fossil fuels. There's no reason it couldn't do both if we could build it fast enough. And yes,
Well,
if you could not only just incentivize clean energy, but also penalize dirty energy with a carbon price, then that would create even more incentives to displace it, but you would still have to build it fast enough to do that.
I think you could argue that one of the reasons that energy demand is expanding is because we've contributed a supply of low cost energy through renewables, right? It's just
I mean,
exactly
yeah,
what happened with Jevons paradox, where coal was available. You could have used coal, but it was expensive, so they didn't. And then the Watson steam engine came along and used coal much more efficiently. Plus, they figured out how to mine coal much more efficiently, and they lowered the price. And coal use soared, right? And now that, by the way, why we have climate change is partly
yeah.
because of the Watson steam engine. And the same thing's happening here. We get low cost wind and solar, and it not only well, it hasn't undercut fossil fuels yet, but it has expanded energy use because it's cheap, and the cheaper it gets, the more it'll expand, right? I mean, that's
I
why
mean,
there's a difference. That's what getting back to the difference between phasing out fossil fuels, which would be obviously naturally replaced with renewables if we
right.
did, versus subsidizing, which makes it even cheaper, renewables.
So, I mean, I would say in theory that could be true, that the Jevons paradox is that as things get cheaper, you just use more of them. And so getting cheaper doesn't actually reduce consumption. However, electricity prices haven't actually gone down. They've just gone up less than they would have if we didn't have renewables. Like they've still gone up because of inflation and because fossil fuel prices have gone up. And we still do use fossil fuels for a lot of our electricity. And so prices still haven't continued to increase and demand has still continued to increase. So I think they're separate. Like the demand is not because electricity is cheap. The demand is because like we got a lot of data center demand. People are driving more electric cars. We're putting more heat pumps in our buildings, just using more electricity for all these different reasons. And developing countries like China, there's just more people who have more wealth, and so they're just using more energy, and so that creates more demand in developing countries as well. And that's kind of separate from electricity prices, which
And
are
does CCL have a policy on AI and data centers and what should be done to control the energy use and therefore emissions from those things?
We don't have a position on that. I mean, the DeepSeek development from China was interesting that they found basically were a more energy efficient AI development there. So that's promising that maybe future AI developments will not have as much power demand. Although again, that comes back to Jevons paradox that if there is, more energy efficient AI, then will more companies start using it or use it more and still create that energy demand. But at this point, that's kind of outside of our purview, and we're just kind of sitting back and seeing, what happens with AI and data centers, and hoping at least a lot of those the tech companies are interested in getting power from clean sources. So that's at least kind of a silver lining there, although some of them are also looking at building natural gas turbines to supply that electricity, but others are looking at nuclear power and microgrids with solar and batteries. So hopefully they will at least take steps on their own to minimize that energy consumption and hopefully get as much of it from clean sources as possible. But at this point, that's not an area we're working on yet.
And by the way, just for your information, I did a show on this, and it turns out that computational efficiency has improved by a factor of 10 trillion
Hmm.
since the ENIAC, and it improves by a factor of 10 every 6 years.
Mhm.
And it's been 13 orders of magnitude improvement so far. And the only thing that's happened is energy use has gone up because
Yeah.
in any other product, you say, I'm going to make this so cheap that everyone will be able to afford it. Everyone would say, wow, use is going to expand like crazy, right? Any other thing, we would say that. But when it comes to this, we say, oh, we're going to improve the energy efficiency. So therefore, it should lower energy demand. But of course, the opposite is when it comes to computation
Mhm.
and energy, those are both insatiable at the right price.
Mhm.
So Jevon's ghost is looking down on one of those on those things. So I'm getting the feeling that CCL does not work in the area of trying to get the public. It's like not public advocacy in a sense. It's you're advocating to Congress, getting the public, the members of CCL to advocate. But you don't you don't have like campaigns to make the public more aware of this or that or anything like that? Or
So when we do, our volunteers will, again, they'll write letters to the editor and op-eds in
all right.
newspapers and do tabling and things like that to reach out to their communities. So we do some of that. We're trying to build general political will, but our main activity is lobbying members of Congress and their staffs.
So let's talk about one of the original things of CCL. That is fee and dividend. Dear to my heart, Jim Hansen told me about it
Yeah.
15, 20 years ago or whatever it was now. And and it's not the same as it's not what everyone thinks. So you put a price on carbon, on the carbon content of fossil fuels, and you collect the money at the well, mine, or port of entry, wherever wherever the fossil fuel companies are getting the stuff out of the ground or coming in on a ship. And then and this price goes up every year by like a fixed amount. It might start at $10. What's the current starting price proposed by CCL nowadays? It used to be 10.
It's t t $15 per ton and rising $10 per ton per year.
Okay, so it hasn't gone up very much in a long time, but $15, but it goes up every year. So, in 10 years, it's going to be over $100.
Mhm.
And then the key to it all is that you take 100% of the money collected, every single penny, and give it back to every legal resident on an equal basis. So, Dana, you and Bill Gates get the same check every month, and everybody gets the same check. And it's since uh, poor people don't spend as much on carbon emitting activities as wealthy people do, it turns out they're going to make more money on the dividend than they pay in higher prices due to the fee. And that was like the U.S. Department of Treasury figured that out. I remember seeing the graphs from them. And so that's why, but I tell people, and I wonder your opinion on this. People think, oh, then you can spend the dividend on, LED light bulbs or an electric car or something, and therefore lower emissions. And I say that it doesn't matter what you spend the money for. The only reason you do this, giving the money back to the public, is so that they accept a very high fee.
Hmm.
And that's really the trick of it all, right? Is that the fossil fuel industry will agree tomorrow to a $50 a ton fee as long as you keep it at $50. But they don't like $100. They certainly don't like $200. I think it's terrible. And so they'll fight against it. But the public, if they knew they're going to make more and more money as the fee goes up, would be really supportive. It'd be the only tax that people would, scream to make it higher. So I don't know.
Yeah,
What's your thoughts on that? That's my summary of fee and dividend. And what did I miss, or what would you say about it?
yeah, that was a good summary. And also the reason to do the dividend is that lower income households, although they spend less overall on energy and thus have lower carbon footprints, and thus the dividend is larger than their increased energy costs if there is a carbon price. they also spend a larger percentage of their income
That's
on
true.
energy. And so if you just do a carbon price and you don't do a dividend, then it hits lower income households the most because it's a bigger percentage of their income. So that's why you do the dividend to make sure that you're not basically penalizing lower doing this at the cost, at the detriment of lower income households.
Right. And that's called a
Um,
regressive tax when you hurt the poor the
right,
most.
exactly.
And fee and dividends, anti-regressive. It
Right.
actually helps the poor the most. The rich actually will pay more in the higher prices due to the fee than they save in
Right.
on the dividend, since they get the same check as everybody does. Uh, but they won't really care that much because it's not going to be a big. I don't think they're going to care very much. It's not a big part of their wealth. Um, but yes, that's true. That is an important thing. It is socially just, and it's a rare policy that kind of hits all the things. It does the job of making fossil fuels more expensive without triggering these Jevons things going on. One way you can control Jevons is by putting a fee on the thing. And so it does that. It helps the poor. It gets public support for a tax. And that's why I think the fossil fuel industry got behind fee and dividend under a slightly different name. But the trick was so people can be aware when you see that Exxon Mobil supports fee and dividend, it is true. They did, but they only support a fee that starts at $40 and goes up like the cost of living or something. So it never really would get much above 50. And they like that's the one they got behind to confuse the public about the real one, which just keeps going up and up and up. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, there are different proposed structures. Some of them start higher and they're relatively flat. And our proposal is to start relatively low so that doesn't have an immediate shock to the system. So it's like it's like $15 per ton is like, less than 15 cents per gallon of
Right.
gasoline. So it's pretty small, but then it increases steadily over time so people know that it's coming and they can adjust their behavior accordingly. And, for example, not buy a guzzling car when they know gasoline prices will be $1 per gallon more in the future. And then also, it does hurt higher income households the most because they use the most energy, but then they also have the most resources to, for example, get solar panels and electric cars and reduce their carbon footprint so that it isn't harming them financially. And that's kind of the whole point of a carbon price is to create that financial incentive for everybody to reduce their emissions. And knowing that that price is going to increase over time, then you have that incentive to take steps to reduce your carbon pollution.
Okay. Um, I was going to ask you that. I don't know if since you're not doing a lot of public advocacy, but the whole messaging about climate change, we talk about it a lot on Climate Chat, and that's this hope versus fear message. There seems to be a lot of people that just want to focus on the hope side. It doesn't look to me like it's worked very well. I don't know, but I mean, why be hopeful unless there's something to be hopeful about, which is, oh, this thing is very scary. Oh, but if you do this, then you can be hopeful. Any thoughts on how we can do a better job at messaging the public and Congress actually about climate in this new world where we're not even supposed to mention the words climate change if you're in the government?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a challenge. And I think like you do want to be careful not to focus too much on either hope or fear. If you focus too much on fear, then people kind of shut down and they just think, oh, the problem is outside of my control. So, it's kind of we call it doomerism, where they think we're just doomed. And so there's no reason to take action because we're doomed. And so why do anything? And so you have to be careful not to make people too afraid. But there's also only so much you can do with hope because, like the people still need to be motivated to do something. You can say, oh yeah, we're going to be okay. But then if people think, oh, we're going to be okay, and then, well, I'm not going to, then it's not an urgent problem and I'm not going to,
Then I
do
can vote for
anything.
Trump
So
if it's going to be
ex
okay.
exactly, exactly. So you kind of have to find the right mix of emotions to evoke. I know that some things that are effective are, telling people that something could be taken away from them, like, the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, rebates and tax credits, like those are in place, and like telling people these could be taken away from you and you won't be able to, get a rebate for getting a heat pump or insulation or all these things in your home, then, perhaps the kind of threat of things being taken away motivates people. So that's one potential area of effective communications. And also just again connecting climate change to people's finances by, telling them, well, if your insurance rates are going up, climate change is playing a role there. all the other ways that climate change impacts us financially, which there's a lot of those. So I think that's a good way to motivate people. But we've been trying to communicate on climate change for a few decades now, and we haven't made a whole lot of success. And so it's a difficult challenge. People are hard to, or it's hard to change their behavior.
Well, actually, you bring up this fear of loss messaging, which I think the Republicans do very well. It's the fear of losing your SUV, your gas stoves,
Yeah.
I don't know, having men compete with your girls in your teams. I don't know, whatever it might be. The fear of losing your traditional way of life. I mean, it's something they do extremely well. I don't think folks on the climate side do a good job of that. Losing your SUV is much more personal than losing your Inflation Reduction Act credits. What is that? I don't even know about that, right? So it's a different kind of thing. Now you're going to lose your house. By the way,
There you
even
go.
losing your medical insurance, which is what Republicans actively promote getting rid of, doesn't seem to. I don't know why, but it doesn't seem to work very well.
Yeah, I think definitely home insurance is going to be a big one because that's kind of
Mhm.
the first really big impact that everybody is feeling, especially and with the LA wildfires, we just saw a lot of people lose their homes, and we're seeing I'm in California, and like everybody in California's insurance rates are probably going to go up because there was not sufficient in private insurance there, and the state had to cover it, and the state doesn't have enough money to back it. So they're passing that along to private insurers, and private insurers are going to pass it along to everybody else. And like, I don't want my home insurance bill to go up, and so I'm going to be pretty ticked off when that happens. And like, I want them to do something about climate change so that happens less. And so I think that's going to be a big one. And it's not just California, it's all over the country. There's worse
Well, Florida
hailstorms,
and California are two
hurricanes.
big areas.
They're the big ones, but there's
California's already, promoting climate. Florida, I don't know what's going to take to turn Florida around.
Florida is seeing some really big increases in home insurance, but there's also in the middle of the country, there's worse hailstorms, and also like just in the eastern part of the country, there's worse flooding, and just everywhere. It's because we have insurance pools. The costs get pooled around everybody, and so like in Oklahoma, they're seeing really big insurance increases because I mean they have worse hail, but they also just they're seeing the spread from other states, and so it's just something that everybody feels, and it's happening right now, and maybe that'll help to motivate people a little bit.
So you're a research coordinator at CCL, and I don't know if CCL has official positions on climate science, but do you or CCL have, and we've been talking a lot recently, the last few months, Jim Hansen's paper and things, 1.5C, 2C, AMOC collapse, things like that. Uh, what's your thought on the state of where we are with climate change right now?
Yeah, it's definitely very concerning. The fact that the past couple of years have been anomalously warm and really difficult to explain why. And there's, James Hansen is attributing a lot of that to reduced basically shipping pollution in the Atlantic, but there's been other research that's suggested that it has to do with the cloud feedback because as climate change changes the way that clouds form, then that is potentially making the Earth less reflective and absorb more sunlight, and
Hmm.
that feedback could potentially be playing a role as well. And so it's definitely concerning. I mean, at this point, like we're still kind of looking at just a few years worth of data that looked a little bit anomalous. And like those of us who have been in the game for a long time will remember in about a decade ago, there was the so-called pause in global warming, which was again just like a short-term blip because there were a lot of La Nina events that happened to cause relatively short-term reductions in temperatures just in the short term, and then we kicked back into El Niños and the warming accelerated again. And so it's important not to focus too much on short-term variability because there are a lot of factors that play a role in year-to-year temperature changes. But certainly, like we do know that as we reduce sulfur pollution by cleaning up things like shipping and coal, that's going to basically reflect less sunlight. We're going to absorb more sunlight. It's going to basically, James Hansen calls it the Faustian bargain, that as we reduce this pollution, it's going to unmask some of the warming from the greenhouse gases. That the greenhouse gases are there, they're going to be there in the atmosphere for a long time. And then this other pollution is going to quickly reduce, and that's going to unmask that warming that's already there from the greenhouse
Right.
gases. So that's certainly something to be concerned about, but it's also something that there's a lot of uncertainty about how much there is, but we're at least aware that that is a thing that, that warming is there. The cloud feedback is very, very uncertain. It could, that could go in either direction, a cooling or a warming effect. So that's, it's not encouraging if it looks like that might be going in the warming effect direction. But modeling clouds is a very, very difficult thing. It's something that scientists have had a hard time doing. So there's just a lot of uncertainty. The AMOC you mentioned, the Atlantic Multidecadal Oscillation in the Atlantic Ocean, that if that slows down or too much or shuts down, that could cause a lot of cooling in Europe. That's definitely concerning. There's a lot of uncertainty about that. So basically, there's a lot of uncertainty about bad things that could happen. That doesn't make me feel very comfortable. I'm not like freaking out about it because it is just uncertainty, but the smart thing to do to avoid these kinds of really bad tail risks, really bad things that could happen if we reach certain points of warming is to reduce emissions as quickly as possible, as much as possible, as quickly as possible. And again, avoiding every tenth of warming is important so that we can reduce the risks of these bad things happening as much as possible. So that's kind of how I view it is risk mitigation, do everything we can to reduce emissions to avoid the risks of these really bad things down the line.
Yeah, you mentioned cloud feedback. By the way, Hansen does talk about that. I mean, he thinks that's absolutely real. And we had George Salutis on from NASA recently talking about how the data now, there's now been enough satellite data to show that indeed clouds are reducing due to global warming. After you can get rid of the noise of the variability, you can kind of see that in the critical areas of the Earth where it matters, the clouds are reducing, and therefore warming leads to less clouds, which leads to more warming. So there definitely is, well, definitely, there appears to be a climate feedback in the wrong direction on clouds, and that's in addition to the shipping thing. That's
Yeah.
really them together that
Yeah,
is
clouds
causing.
are interesting because like high altitude clouds are kind of wispy, but they're water vapor, and water vapor is a greenhouse gas. So the more high altitude clouds you have, the more warmer you get, but the more low altitude clouds you have, which are kind of floofier and whiter and they reflect more sunlight, the more cooling you get. And so it's a question of like, do you get more or less high altitude clouds and more or less low altitude clouds, and
Right.
what is that effect of that? And there have been a couple of papers recently that have suggested that less low altitude clouds will
Yeah.
then result in more warming, which is not what we were hoping to see, but
And then any listeners who want to learn more about that, just check out the Climate Chat program with George Salutis called Global Warming, arrow, fewer clouds, arrow, more warming. And you can, it's pretty recently, you can find that. And yeah, okay. So yeah, do what we can. But we seem to, any thoughts on, like, for example, AMOC collapse and things? So that's, you can do what you can, but if you don't do enough, then you're still screwed anyway. Nature doesn't really care what you
yeah.
try to do. It only cares what you do. Um, and is that part of CCL policy at all, or do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, there's not much directly you can do to slow down the AMOC collapse except for reduce emissions and reduce warming. And again, like there's a lot of uncertainty about how fast it's going to slow down, and it's kind of, we'll know more by mid-century just how much it's slowing down and whether it's
That's
endangering
indeed true,
collapse.
but it's not
Yeah.
a good thing.
It's not a good thing, no. But again, all we can do is reduce emissions as fast as possible and try to reduce that risk. But other than that, there's not really much you can do because it's dependent on like the Greenland ice sheet and how quickly that collapses and melts and goes into the ocean and reduces salinity and things like that. So like,
Well, actually, there is a paper out. One other area I was going to ask you about. There is a paper out fairly. I'm actually not sure it's published yet, but it was released. For maybe it's pre-peer review that showed that doing solar radiation management the right way, because it would actually strengthen the AMOC. And that's one of the things we can do. Does CCL or yourself have any thoughts or opinions on what's sometimes called solar geoengineering or solar radiation management?
Me personally, I mean, some opinions just that I view it as kind of a break glass in case of emergency solution that just
Mhm.
because if you start to pump things into the atmosphere to reduce sunlight, like that could have all kinds of potential side effects, like just reducing sunlight, like who knows what's that going to do to plant life, for example, and what if that pollution gets, and it affects people directly, and then we're breathing that pollution. So yeah, like, you have to put it high enough in the atmosphere, and it's a risky thing to do. And allowing global warming to continue is also a risky thing to do. And so I prefer not to combat one risk by introducing another risk if possible. So again, reducing emissions maybe pulling carbon out of the atmosphere is like a form of geoengineering. That's kind of at least a good way to do it because then we're just reversing the unintentional geoengineering that we've already done by putting the carbon into the atmosphere. So like if we're going to do a form of geoengineering, like I would view like carbon removal as a good form of geoengineering, but pumping another pollutant into the atmosphere to offset the first pollutant that we put into the atmosphere, I would prefer not to do that unless we get to a point where it's kind of an emergency and we have to do it. But it's also good to do the research to know as much as we can about the associated risks and how we could do it and things like that. So researching it in the meantime is a good thing to do, but I would not want to actually introduce it until like we reached a point where we felt like we absolutely had to do it.
Right. Yeah, we had David Keith on, I don't know, a month or so ago. It was part of a paper that showed that not doing SRM would kill 400,000 people a year more than doing SRM. And that was very conservative, not really looking at all the impacts of climate change, just very narrow band of things. So there is research going on, and I think most people agree that we just need to do more research, although there's some people that advocate for stopping all research, which I think is a little crazy, but we'll see what happens there. So CCL's been around. By the way, how long has CCL been around? It's
Um,
20 years, right?
Roughly 17 years or so, something along those
Oh,
lines,
okay.
something like that.
And so we haven't gotten there yet. I've been pushing for CCL. I mean, what CCL stands for that whole time. I was actually with James Hansen when you guys were asking him whether he could join, and he was getting opinions on that, and I thought it was a great idea. And he has been a big supporter of CCL and a big supporter of being dividend, by the way, for
Yeah.
forever.
Yeah, I believe
Um,
he's been on our advisory board. Yeah.
yeah. So, but it hasn't worked. Okay. What is CCL doing, now? I mean, I'm sure you're all scrambling with the new administration. What are some of the new things that you'll be doing or changing things in order to deal with the current administration and still try to make progress?
So one thing we recently did because there have been the attacks on NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, is we kind of engaged our volunteers to contact their members of Congress in support of NOAA and protecting NOAA, to have their members of Congress talk to the administration and be like, can we please not eradicate this really important scientific and weather predicting agency? So things like that where we have to play some defense to protect important scientific agencies against, attacks by the administration. We're doing that, but we're kind of playing it by ear. In some of these things you have to be reactive to see what exactly the administration is going to do because they're right now very unpredictable, and it's hard to figure out what exactly they're going to do. But actions like that, and then as I mentioned, advocating for preservation of the Inflation Reduction Act incentives as much as possible. And then the other policies that we're going to advocate for related to forests and permitting reform, hopefully down the line, and things like that, and potentially a carbon tariff will be interesting. That could potentially be relatively soon in the tax negotiations. So we'll see what happens with that. We're kind of keeping an eye on that.
Okay. Wow. What do you before we get to questions from others, what would you recommend in people listening to this program, individuals, what can individuals do to get more engaged on climate, maybe and perhaps engage with CCL, but in general, what do you recommend for individuals?
Yeah, I mean, we've got CCL chapters, as I said, all over the country and just about every congressional district. And so engaging in those chapters and becoming a member is a really good thing to do. I would also say, given that the current Congress is controlled by Republicans in the majority, in CCL, we have developed relationships over the years with every congressional office, including Republicans. And they always tell us like they like meeting with us because we don't go in there and yell at them. We actually have positive, encouraging, engaging, and appreciating of meetings with them when we meet with them. And so we actually have some influence with the current majority, whereas a lot of other climate environmental groups have kind of given up on the Republican Party, which, I understand, but at the same time, they're half of the government, and right now they're the half that's in control. And so, like, if you want to have influence over policy, joining CCL is a good way to do it. So yeah, that's kind of an important thing to do. People can also engage in state and local work, trying to get climate policies passed on a state and local level, either with advocacy groups or just engaging with their state and local governments. things like that. Engaging in the political process, of course, is always important.
When you are part of a local chapter, there's also engagements that happen. Like I think I don't know if it's weekly calls, but sometimes weekly or monthly calls, and it's also a little bit of a support network in a sense too, right? Because you have
Yes,
like-minded
absolutely.
people that are working on something together. So it's really worthwhile thing to do.
Yeah, yeah,
It's one
exactly.
of
We have
the climate organizations I always recommend people to join if they're interested in, you know, working with others on climate action.
Yeah, we have national monthly meetings, and then local chapters will often have their own meetings, and then they'll also they're doing their own projects like tabling and putting on events and writing letters to the editor and things like that. And it definitely helps to have like the support group to talk to about what's concerning you about the administration and climate change and what are we going to do about it. And it feels really good. It helps to be doing something about it. And like when we meet with our
Hmm.
members of Congress, we do it. There's a virtual conference and an in-person conference once every year. So in the summer, we go to DC and meet with our members of Congress directly, and people always feel very empowered and like they're talking directly to the people who are making these decisions about what climate policies we're going to pass, and to like tell them like here's why we should pass this climate policy and actually engage with the decision makers directly. It really makes people feel good and feel empowered and feel like they're doing something and making a difference and not just sitting back and riding along with what the administration's doing on their behalf.
Okay. Well, let's bring Stacy in. I think there's Stacy. I know you're out somewhere, out and about, but been able to call in. Do you have a question, Stacy, or any from? Oh, there you go. Oh, I thought you were going to be outside or something, but welcome.
Hi. Yeah. Hi. So nice for you to be here, Dana. Yeah, I am coming from the library at UC Santa Barbara.
Oh, yeah.
I'm down visiting my daughter. I came down last night, and yes, it's nice to be here. Nice to see you. Thanks for joining us. Um, I have some from, so I was late online. Apologies. I have some from online, but I'd like to see if there are a few more before I ask. I'll just um, sort of drop in with I am a member of Citizens Climate Lobby, but I am a resident of San Francisco and feel like, what is the point of me? Because anyone that is one of my elected representatives, I'm pretty sure is on the right page. So how much, I don't know that I help the cause. It would be more about twisting my mother's arm in central Pennsylvania, the heart of red country. What do you have to say about that for Citizens Climate Lobby?
Yeah, for those of us who are in Democratic represented districts, it's a little bit more difficult because like Democrats are in the minority. They have a lot less influence over what's going to happen policy-wise than Republicans do. And so like I too, my representatives are all Democrats, and so I kind of have to deal with that myself. But like there are still areas that we need Democrats to come on board with, like permitting reform. We have to convince them why permitting reform is a net good, for example, and hopefully we'll be working on that maybe later this year, depending on what happens in Congress and areas like that. So there's still things that we need to do with our Democratic representatives and there's also some forestry policies. There's a bill called Fix Our Forests that is, there's a lot more Republican support than Democrat support right now, which we could talk about if you're interested. But it's a bill related to forest management and wildfire management and things like that. So there are policies they're working on that we still need to convince Democrats are the right thing to do in terms of climate solutions. And then you can also still be engaged in local policies. In California, we do a lot of great climate policies statewide. So you can also be engaged in that, although CCL is more focused on Congress.
And have you, I mean, I don't know what to say about the new administration, but have you talked with Doug Burnham at all? Because while he was governor of a red state, he has said some things that are surprisingly, I agree with. So I just wondered if you had engaged with him at all.
No, I think Doug Burgum is Secretary of the Interior, I believe, and so he's
Mhm.
going to be dealing with a lot of like federal land policies. So again, we're focused on Congress and not on the executive branch.
No.
Oh, oh, okay. Oh, right. I guess. But I would think that any lever you have to pull on that side of the line, even if they aren't directly responsible for it, like, hey, could you mention that at, your um, McDonald's dinner with the dude or whatever.
Yeah.
I think he might
Yeah.
be receptive to some things, surprisingly.
Yeah, I think so too. Doug Burgum is kind of interesting at Interior, and Christopher Wright, I believe, is Department of Energy, and he's at least interested in some clean technologies like geothermal and nuclear and maybe renewables, although it remains to be seen. But those two do seem like they'll at least do some good things at those federal agencies, hopefully. So yeah, we'll keep an eye on that. And if we have opportunities to influence them, we certainly will.
Okay.
Okay.
I'll be back with some of the,
Okay.
hopefully we'll have more from the audience. Okay.
Yeah, and
Thank
by the way,
you.
if you are on YouTube, on Zoom, we can see them. If you did post a question on YouTube, just repost it and start with the word question, colon, so we can
I,
easily
yep,
see them.
I put that
You got that?
suggestion out just a few minutes ago,
Good.
and
Okay.
have what had been up to date. Okay. Thanks. I'll
And
be
in the
back.
meantime, let's Eli, welcome. And what's your question for Dana?
Hi, so this is a bit topical, but I think it's very, very pertinent. Uh, During the first Trump administration, there was a proposal to split up NOAA and essentially privatize at least large portions of the National Weather Service. In the Project 2025 document, they referred to NOAA's and the National Weather Service's attribution of catastrophic weather to climate change as the climate alarm industry. And the important thing is that when these extreme weather events and their catastrophic results happen, there had been a move to climate attribution to say that, well, this tornado was 20 times more likely due to climate change, to really connect it to people when something big is making an impression on them. The Trump administration is trying to prevent that in every way possible, and I think this is very strategic from their point of view, in terms of doing what they can to suppress motivation to do something about climate. So I'm wondering, has Citizens Climate Lobby thought about specific event type campaigns to focus on issues like this, possibly in concert with other organizations, but most importantly, leveraging the kind of dossiers that you've collected on specific Congress people?
We haven't done specific campaigns. We've done some education, for example, around the LA wildfires. We were already doing kind of an educational event related to kind of fire policies, fire mitigation policies, and talking about that. And when I did that, I mentioned there was an attribution study about the impact of climate change on making the probability of the LA wildfires worse. And so we do some education around that. Um, Certainly, it's something that we can do when we have our meetings with members of Congress. If there is like a local weather event that there has been an attribution study about, if it could be useful to our lobbying, we can mention it. But yeah, also have to bear in mind the receptiveness of the member of Congress that you're meeting with. Like, will that make them more likely to support a climate policy, or will they just turn on their defense mechanisms if they hear something like that? So it's very specific to individual members of Congress in terms of, utilize what we utilize in our lobbying. Usually we'd like to focus more on just like the individual policies and the benefits of the policy as opposed to getting a large scale, like here's what's happening with climate change, because everybody's kind of heard the science at this point. Whether they accept the science or reject it is kind of an individual psychological issue that, it's not something that we can address in our brief lobbying time. So it's something
All
that
right. Do
we
you think most people are aware of? I don't think most people are aware of AMOC collapse in possibly 10, 20 years. I mean, as Hanson's been talking about and many other researchers this
maybe,
last
yeah,
year or so.
maybe not that level of detail, but I mean, again, like just, telling people about the various climate impacts and the probabilities of those and what the science says is not necessarily going to change their opinion. Like them again, they might just trigger a denial and they might just say, "Oh, I don't believe that bit of science, and I think you're being an alarmist," and then that just then that puts up the defense mechanisms, and they're less receptive to listening to your policy solutions if they're in a defensive posture.
You're talking about the Congress people you're talking to, basically.
Right. Yeah, so then that's again, that's kind of our main lever in impacting policies, talking to members of Congress and their staffs. But if you're doing an overall educational event, then certainly that's a different situation. It depends on who your audience is there, and if you're trying to educate people about various climate risks, then certainly talking about potential AMOC, slowdown and collapse, is a good thing to do.
So I was in touch with the Biden administration about this. Used the phrase, "It's a clear and present danger," which has certain meaning in the military and in risk assessment. And by the way, they believed it. I mean, they agreed, I should say, with my assessment of that. I don't know. I mean, if you don't, I would bet you that 80 to 90% of Congress people have no idea what's going on with the AMOC and what danger. Okay. Certainly Republicans. I would be surprised if even many of the Democrats do. But true. I don't know. At some point, the messaging we've been using doesn't work, so we have to try some new messaging. And it's not like we're making stuff up. These are real dangers. And you used to say, well, it's uncertain. Uncertainty is not your friend, right? I mean, if things are uncertain, it's all the more reason to act. If you were, if you're going to play Russian roulette, you're not quite sure how many bullets are in the chamber. It's uncertain, but I would suggest don't play that game, unless you're 100% certain there are 0 bullets in the chamber.
Right.
And right now there's about 5. So anyway, Stacy, do you have more from YouTube and things? I'm looking at the YouTube. There's a lot of comments about, CCL should take more of a stand on the military side of what's going on with Greenland and Canada, things like that. But that's not, you do have international chapters. So what do they do, since they're not obviously lobbying Congress?
Yeah, I mean, that's up to the individual chapter, but in some cases they lobby for a carbon fee and dividend type of policy in their country. Okay. So yeah, but nationally we like to stay focused on our 4 policy areas, because staying focused kind of maximizes your advocacy effectiveness. If you kind of spread things out to doing too many different areas that you're advocating in, then you don't get any one thing done. So that's why we always, for 15 years, so we only focused on carbon fee and dividend, because we're trying to maximize our effectiveness there. And we got reasonably close in the last Congress to getting a carbon fee passed. It didn't quite work.
Really? In the last Congress? Really?
In the last Democratic Congress, not the last 2 Congresses ago, I guess it was, when Democrats went trifecta. When they passed the Inflation Reduction Act, it almost had a carbon price in it.
Yeah, people don't know, but the fee and dividend legislation has been introduced in Congress like all the time, right? I mean, and I've read them, the bills, so they're the real deal. I mean, it's really fee and dividend. And yet, of course.
Yeah.
And then even back to Obama, when he could have passed something like that, he went after healthcare instead. So.
Yeah, and when we've done lobbying, we've also done secondary ask for smaller pieces of legislation, and sometimes we've done like several different ones, and sometimes just done 1 or 2. And we found that when we only do 1 or 2 pieces of secondary asks of our members of Congress, that it's much more effective at advancing those and getting more co-sponsors and potentially passing them than if we do several different asks. So the more focused we can be on just a few solutions, the more likely we are to be able to advance those successfully. And so we try not to expand too much.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And Stacy, any further questions? I didn't see any real questions in the chat.
Well, I would, I mean, so the Canada and Greenland was brought up by Nadia, and I would totally say that as well, because I think that that would have climate effects, and it's also a distraction. So it's almost more of getting them to focus away from those things, to realize how, I don't know, I don't want to call things foolish to them, but you would come up with a better wording. that this is the thing that is absolutely most imperative for us to deal with. I'm a child, Gen Xer, and I think about the Sting song, "Do the Russians love their children too?" And it's like that just keeps playing in my head when I think about these politicians, and how they go off on these tangents and don't address climate. It's like, do they love their children?
Do Americans love their children too?
Yeah, it's us now. We're the problem. Well, we've been the problem. The other one other thing she had mentioned was market mechanisms being able to avert emissions killing billions and billions by inducing droughts, et cetera, is extreme.
Well, I think she mentioned the inability for market mechanisms to avoid that, right? What was that?
Yeah, I guess, yeah, it's well, that it's extremely unlikely.
Right.
Why are they the policy focus then?
Oh, well, I mean, like extreme weather is going to continue to happen and continue to get worse as long as temperatures continue to go up. And so, like, the policy focus is to stop those emissions from going up and to get them to go down to zero eventually so that we can stop warming from going up, because as long as global warming keeps going up, then those impacts like droughts and hurricanes and wildfires just keep getting worse. And so the first thing you got to do is stop them from getting worse. And there's still other policy solutions and mechanisms you need to do to mitigate or to adapt, basically, to become more resilient to those impacts, like trying to figure out how to make drought-resistant crops and potentially grow crops in other places, and figure out how to mitigate the impacts of droughts and also wildfires and hurricanes and floods and all these other extreme weather events. Like, there's kind of two different categories. There's the stopping the problem, the mitigation, and there's also the adapting to the problem that we've caused so far and that will continue to get worse until we get that mitigation problem solved. And so it's just two different areas. And, again, there's only so much we as one organization can do. And so we focus on stopping the problem, but there does also have to be focus on adapting to the problem that is kind of ongoing and will continue to have these bad impacts.
Yeah, so the one thing I forgot to ask you is how big is CCL? How many members do you have around the world?
Our most active, so we have like a large list of members, but then the like active members, I believe, is around 12 to 15,000, something along those lines.
Mm-hmm. And it's a real grassroots. I mean, it is truly a grassroots organization, and a lot of people claim to be that, but CCL really is. And if you'd like to learn more about CCL, there's a link in the description. There's a link to Dana's page on CCL. By the way, you wrote some books, or I see it up and behind you there. Do you want to plug any of those while you're here?
Oh, sure. I mean, I wrote the one right there is Climatology versus Pseudoscience. It was just kind of a variety of, it was sort of a conglomeration of blog posts that I've written for Skeptical Science about the history of climate science and climate myths and some policy stuff in there. Although it was 2015, so it's now 10 years old, so it's a little bit out of date at this point. But if anybody wants to buy it, I would encourage them to do so.
By the way, for anyone who has a crazy uncle or a spouse or something that spouts some climate denier myth, I really, truly recommend skepticalscience.com. And we had John Cook on. It was back when it was Clubhouse and not YouTube, but we had John Cook on.
Nice.
And it's a great website. If I'm talking to a climate denier online, I just don't bother explaining it. I just provide the link to skepticalscience.com, which it not only explains why it's a myth, but gives the links to the science that backs it up and everything, like CO2 lags temperature, or the other way around. I can remember temperature lags CO2, and then everything. It's all in there. Hundreds of myths that have been debunked long ago. They're still popping up today, which is still pretty amazing. Yeah. So Dan, I want to thank you for coming on here. I actually, I've known about CCL forever, but I do have a better perspective of it now, and the focus on the lobbying Congress, as well as some public outreach. I've always see those letters to the editor. They're coming from CCL when you see something about being dividend in the local newspaper or the national newspaper.
Yeah.
So keep it up. I guess I'm not as optimistic as you are that there's going to be a significant progress in the next few years. Although I'll end with this question I actually had for you. I've been asking various guests on the show. I have this potential silver lining for a Trump presidency. And one is that, as I was kind of alluding to, I don't think Biden on net did anything for climate. He did the Inflation Reduction Act, but also increased fossil fuel production. And you're saying that he had no choice, but whatever. Under his administration, climate change didn't get better. on net, I would say. But that was somebody saying we should do something about climate change. Now we have a president who's absolutely saying, I'm not going to do anything about climate change. For sure, he'll tell you himself, you don't have to rely on others. And yet, the climate impacts that we're going to have over the next 4 years, under either administration, by the way, are going to happen. And now there'll be someone to blame because it's going to be clearly climate change for many of them. And that might help. That's one way it might help. And the other silver lining is he might crash the global economy. And that, of course, would be great for climate. So maybe one of the things we could actually do. It's not really the right way to do it, but it still gets the job done. What are your thoughts on both of those?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm just going back to President Biden really quickly. Like the Inflation Reduction Act did have a quantitative impact on reducing U.S. emissions. So I would say
Yeah.
on net, like that was good. Like we saw an emissions reductions during the COVID pandemic because everything shut down, and I think like everybody would agree we don't want to reduce emissions that way. Like that's not a good way to do it because that was pretty miserable. And so like ideally we would reduce emissions without the misery. So I would prefer to go that way, but certainly
Me
like
too.
if there were a big negative impact on the global economy, like yes, that would reduce emissions. It's just that's not a good way to do it, but that would have that effect. So
Right.
hopefully, well, we can kind of solve the problem in over time without having to resort to like global economic crashes and things like that.
Well, time is of the essence, as they say. So that's the key. Yeah, we will address this, and eventually, the question is when, which is how I ended my TEDx talk, by the way. I said we're going to do fee and dividend someday.
Someday.
The question is when. And
Mhm.
and by the way, I don't know, maybe you would recommend this too, but at the end of my talk, I recommend one thing you can do is talk to everyone you know about climate change and
Yes.
what your fears are and what your hopes are and the solutions you heard about, including fee and dividend. And that when everyone's talking about it, then maybe we'll do something. And by the way, joining the Citizen Climate Lobby is a great way to learn more about climate and all these solutions as well. So thanks for being on. Really appreciate it. And again, I learned, even though I've known about CCL forever, I've learned a bunch myself, and I hope everyone else did. Stacy, thank you. Eli, thank you. Thanks everyone who sent us questions and comments. Also, as I said before, please like and subscribe. It's kind of a very easy thing you can do to help spread detailed climate information to more people. And the more people that are subscribed, more people that like it, the more people that see the videos. And so that makes a difference. And as I mentioned, some upcoming guests we're having is Jim Hansen pretty soon. I'm working with him on a date. That'll be a special program, not one of the regular Sunday programs. And then David Fenton coming up, great climate communicator about all things, but especially about climate. Peter Glick, Bill McKibben, and others. So stay tuned, subscribe, like, get that notification bell, all of those kinds of things. Dan, thanks for all you're doing. And give my best to everyone at CCL because, again, I think it's a great organization. And
Yeah.
we certainly have some tough times ahead, but we need everybody fighting. So thanks for what you're doing.
Yeah, thanks. I enjoyed the conversation. Thanks for having me, and thanks for what you're doing too.
Thanks. Everyone, we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.